Some wolves follow commands. Others follow the truth their masters are too afraid to speak. Every servant in Ashthorn Keep knew the rule. Never ask where the Alpha King's wolf disappeared after midnight. The guards pretended not to notice the enormous silver-gray shadow slipping through the eastern corridor. The housekeepers quietly ignored the oversized paw prints that always vanished before sunrise, and the castle steward had long since stopped replacing the latch outside a certain guest room, because somehow it was always found unfastened by morning. No one spoke of it aloud, not because they feared the wolf, but because they feared the answer. Emily Carter certainly didn't know she had become the center of the kingdom's quietest mystery. She had arrived at the royal keep barely 3 weeks earlier, a humble Omega selected to organize the neglected archives in the Old North Wing after years spent restoring weathered journals for a village library nearly 200 miles away. She preferred forgotten books to crowded banquets, rainy afternoons to celebrations, and silence to attention. In a palace filled with ambitious nobles hoping to earn the Alpha King's favor, Emily was almost invisible. She liked it that way. Every evening she carried a lantern through the quiet hall, brushed the dust from shelves older than the kingdom itself, and returned to her modest room tucked beneath a curved staircase overlooking the moonlit gardens. The room was small but warm, with a narrow fireplace, a rocking chair beside the window, and a quilt stitched by hands she imagined belonged to someone who had once called the castle home. It was peaceful. At least, it had been on the first night. She woke sometime before dawn because something heavy rested against the side of her bed. For one impossible second, she thought a fallen beam had crashed through the ceiling. Then she heard the slow, steady rhythm of breathing. She opened her eyes and nearly forgot how to breathe herself. Curled across the woven rug with one massive paw hanging over the blanket was the Alpha King's legendary wolf. Moonlight silvered every strand of its thick fur, and even asleep it looked magnificent, powerful, and strangely gentle. Emily froze beneath her quilt. The stories claimed the king's wolf could sense lies from across a ballroom and recognize fear before a heartbeat changed. Yet this terrifying creature simply sighed in its sleep, shifted slightly closer, and rested its enormous head beside the edge of her mattress, as though it had done so 100 times before. She didn't scream. She didn't run. Instead, after several long minutes, she whispered the first thought that came into her mind. "You must have taken a wrong turn." One amber eye blinked open. The wolf regarded her with calm intelligence, gave a slow wag of its tail against the wooden floor, and promptly closed its eye again. Somehow, that felt even stranger. At sunrise, a frantic knock rattled her door. 3 royal guards stood outside, trying very hard not to look embarrassed. Behind them stood Alpha King Cale Ashford himself, dressed in a dark charcoal coat that looked impossibly crisp despite the early hour. His silver eyes landed first on the wolf, then on Emily, then back to the wolf again. For a moment no one spoke. Finally Cale folded his arms and let out the faintest breath. "There you are." The wolf lazily stretched, stood, and crossed the room without the slightest hint of guilt before sitting obediently beside him. Emily hurried to apologize, convinced she had somehow broken an important royal rule. "Your Majesty, I'm so sorry. I don't know how he got in here." Cale glanced toward the wolf, whose expression remained almost suspiciously innocent. "Neither do I," he answered evenly. "Instincts." One guard looked at the floor to hide the smile, threatening to escape. Another suddenly found the hallway fascinating. Emily nodded uncertainly, because what else could she do? Surely the Alpha King understood his own wolf better than anyone. Cale offered a polite apology for the disturbance, turned on his heel, and walked away with the great wolf pacing quietly beside him. The mystery should have ended there. Instead, the following morning, Emily awoke to discover the wolf asleep beside her bed once again, exactly where it had been before, as though leaving had simply been part of a nightly routine no one had bothered to explain. Emily spent the rest of that morning convincing herself there had to be a perfectly ordinary explanation, even if she could not imagine what it might be. Castles were old. Doors swelled with damp weather. Perhaps the latch had not caught properly. Perhaps royal wolves had habits no one outside the palace understood. By lunchtime, she had repeated those thoughts often enough that they almost sounded reasonable. Almost. The trouble was that the following evening, she checked the door 3 separate times before climbing into bed. She tested the latch with both hands, slid the heavy wooden bolt into place, and even balanced a stack of 3 thick history books against the bottom of the door. If anything entered the room during the night, the books would fall. She smiled to herself, quietly pleased with the simple plan, then extinguished the lantern and drifted to sleep beneath the gentle crackling of the fireplace. When dawn painted pale gold across the ceiling, Emily slowly opened her eyes. The books still stood neatly against the door. The bolt remained locked exactly where she had left it. Nothing appeared disturbed except for one impossible detail. The enormous silver-gray wolf was sleeping peacefully beside her rocking chair, with its fluffy tail wrapped around its paws, as though it had always belonged there. Emily sat upright, so quickly that the quilt slipped into her lap. She stared at the locked door, then at the wolf, then back at the door again. "That is simply not possible," she whispered. One amber eye opened lazily before the wolf answered with nothing more than an amused little huff through its nose. Somehow the sound felt suspiciously close to a laugh. Emily climbed carefully out of bed and crouched beside the books. Every one of them remained perfectly balanced. No scratches marked the windows. The chimney was far too narrow. She inspected every inch of the room until she finally turned toward her unexpected visitor with folded arms. "You are either the smartest wolf in the kingdom," she said softly, "or I am much more tired than I realized." The wolf tipped its head slightly as though considering the question before walking toward her with slow, unhurried steps. Emily held her breath. Instead of behaving like the fearsome creature described in every story she had ever heard, it gently nudged its head beneath her hand. The motion was so careful that she instinctively stroked the thick fur behind one ear. It was softer than she expected, warm from sleep, carrying the clean scent of pine forests after rain. The wolf closed its eyes with unmistakable satisfaction. Emily immediately withdrew her hand. "You should not enjoy that," she murmured. "You are making this far too confusing." A sharp knock interrupted the quiet. Before Emily could answer, the wolf calmly crossed the room and sat near the fireplace as though waiting for inspection. When she opened the door, 2 palace maids stood outside carrying fresh linens. They froze almost instantly. One blinked twice. The other stared at the wolf before quickly lowering her gaze. "Good morning, Miss Carter," the older maid said with remarkable composure. "We brought clean bedding." Emily stepped aside awkwardly. Neither maid commented on the enormous royal wolf occupying half the room, but both exchanged the briefest glance while pretending to smooth wrinkles from the blankets. It lasted less than a second. Emily still noticed. As soon as they departed, she heard muffled whispers disappearing down the hallway. She could not make out the words, only the unmistakable rhythm of people trying not to gossip while absolutely gossiping. By breakfast, the atmosphere around the castle had changed in ways that were almost impossible to describe. Servants who had barely acknowledged her yesterday now greeted her with unusually warm smiles. Footmen politely stepped aside before she reached the corridor. Even the elderly librarian offered her the largest cinnamon roll from the morning tray without explanation. Emily accepted it with quiet confusion, wondering whether everyone in the castle had suddenly decided to become extraordinarily kind overnight. Across the grand dining hall, Alpha King Cale Ashford appeared exactly as composed as ever. He spoke calmly with advisors reviewing maps spread across the long oak table. His posture remained perfectly straight, his expression unreadable, his movements precise. If not for the wolf sitting obediently beside his chair, no one would have guessed anything unusual had happened. Then, as though sensing her eyes upon him, Cale looked up. Their gazes met across the crowded room for the briefest instant. Emily immediately lowered her eyes, embarrassed to have been caught staring. When she dared another glance, the king was already returning his attention to the maps as though nothing at all had happened. Later that afternoon, while carrying a stack of weathered journals through the north corridor, Emily encountered Cale unexpectedly near the castle gardens. The wolf walked several steps behind him until it noticed her. Its ears lifted instantly. Before anyone could react, it trotted straight past the king and stopped beside Emily with unmistakable enthusiasm. Cale closed his eyes for one quiet heartbeat before exhaling almost imperceptibly. "Interesting," he muttered. Emily looked between the king and the wolf uncertainly. "Your Majesty, I promise I have not encouraged this." Cale studied the wolf with the resigned patience of someone losing an argument he had never intended to fight. Finally, he answered in the same calm voice as before. Instincts. The explanation sounded identical to yesterday. Only this time, even he did not appear entirely convinced by it. Emily quickly discovered that castles possessed a language entirely their own, one spoken without words. Conversation stopped half a second too early when she entered a room. Smiles lingered just a little longer than before. Servants who had never learned her name suddenly greeted her with cheerful confidence, while visiting nobles seemed to study her face as though trying to solve a puzzle no one had explained. No one asked her direct questions. No one mentioned the wolf. Yet somehow everyone seemed to know exactly what had been happening each night. Emily could not understand how a secret that had never been spoken aloud already felt like the worst-kept mystery inside Ashthorn Keep. She buried herself in work, hoping old books would prove easier to understand than people. The castle archives stretched beneath the northern towers, where shelves climbed nearly 20 feet toward vaulted ceilings painted with fading constellations. Dust drifted through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight, and the scent of aged parchment wrapped around the room like a familiar blanket. Here, surrounded by forgotten histories, Emily almost convinced herself that life had returned to normal. Almost. A soft thump echoed behind her. She turned slowly. The great silver-gray wolf had somehow wandered into the archives without making a sound. It sat patiently between two towering bookcases with remarkable dignity, watching her with calm amber eyes. Emily looked toward the open doorway. "You are not supposed to be here," she whispered. The wolf answered by walking over to the reading table and lying beside her chair with the unmistakable confidence of someone who believed it had every right to remain. Emily sighed despite herself. "You truly do whatever you want, do not you?" The wolf rested its chin across one oversized paw. Several minutes later, the elderly head librarian appeared, carrying an armful of restored manuscripts. He stopped so suddenly that a loose page floated gently onto the floor. Emily hurried to help him gather the papers, apologizing before he could say a word. "I am so sorry. I tried to send him away." The old librarian adjusted his spectacles, looked from Emily to the wolf, then back again. To her complete surprise, he smiled. "Young lady," he said kindly, "I do not believe anyone has ever successfully sent him anywhere he did not wish to go." With that curious remark, he calmly continued shelving books as though the royal wolf keeping company with a quiet omega happened every afternoon. Emily stared after him in disbelief. The longer the day continued, the stranger everything became. Palace gardeners greeted the wolf with respectful nods. Kitchen staff quietly placed an extra bowl of fresh water near the back entrance without anyone requesting it. Even the royal tailor paused in the hallway, smiled knowingly at Emily, and simply wished her a pleasant afternoon before walking away. It felt less like people were surprised and more like they were waiting for something she did not yet understand. Late that evening, Emily carried a bundle of repaired journals toward the council chamber, where royal advisors often requested old records before important meetings. The heavy wooden doors stood partially open. She intended only to leave the books with the steward outside. Then she heard a familiar voice. "Your Majesty," one advisor asked carefully, "should we be concerned about the recent situation?" Kale answered with his usual calm. "There is no situation." "With respect," another advisor replied, "your wolf has visited the same room every night for several weeks." Emily froze before reaching the doorway. She had assumed the strange visits began only after her arrival. Several weeks. That was impossible. She had not even lived in the castle that long. Kale remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "Instincts." Someone inside the chamber cleared his throat. Another voice, older and warmer, answered gently. "Majesty, instincts generally do not develop such reliable schedules." A few restrained chuckles followed before the room became quiet once more. Kale spoke again, his tone perfectly composed despite the amusement surrounding him. "The matter requires no further discussion." Emily quietly stepped backward before anyone noticed her standing outside. Her thoughts spun faster with every step down the corridor. If the advisors were correct, then the wolf had been searching for something long before she arrived at Ashthorn Keep. Why would it suddenly begin visiting her room on the very night she moved into the castle? Nothing about the story made sense. As twilight settled over the gardens, Emily wandered onto a stone terrace overlooking the fountains. hoping the cool evening air might settle her racing thoughts. The first stars shimmered above the distant mountains while lanterns flickered to life along winding paths below. Footsteps approached behind her. She turned to find Cale standing several feet away, hands folded behind his back, his expression as unreadable as ever. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily gathered enough courage to break the silence. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "does your wolf always choose people this way?" Cale looked toward the darkening sky before answering. No. It was the shortest honest answer she had ever heard from him. Emily waited, expecting an explanation, but none came. Instead, the familiar silver-gray wolf emerged from the shadows of the garden path, walked directly between them, and calmly leaned against her side with complete trust. Cale watched the scene without moving. For the first time since they had met, the certainty in his silver eyes wavered ever so slightly, as though the wolf had just ignored an order that had never been spoken aloud. The days settled into a rhythm that no one in Ashthorn Keep could explain, yet everyone quietly accepted. Every morning, Emily found the great silver-gray wolf waiting somewhere nearby, sometimes outside the archive doors, sometimes beside the fountain in the eastern courtyard, and sometimes curled peacefully outside her room before sunrise. It never demanded attention. It simply appeared, as though an invisible thread always led it back to her. At first, Emily remained cautious, convinced she should keep her distance from the royal companion. But caution slowly gave way to familiarity. She began greeting the wolf each morning with a gentle smile instead of startled silence. If she carried too many books through the corridors, the wolf walked beside her with calm patience, discouraging anyone from accidentally bumping into the towering stack balanced in her arms. When she paused in the gardens to enjoy the fresh spring air, the wolf stretched out beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree and watched butterflies drift across the flower beds with surprising curiosity. One rainy afternoon, she discovered that the wolf disliked thunder far less than she had expected, but seemed fascinated by the sound of raindrops striking the castle windows. Emily laughed softly as it tilted its head every few seconds, following the changing rhythm outside. "You really are nothing like the stories," she whispered. The wolf answered by resting its chin gently against her knee, closing its amber eyes as though content with nothing more than her company. Without realizing it, Emily reached for the wooden brush resting beside the fireplace in the archive reading room. She hesitated only briefly before carefully brushing the thick silver fur along the wolf's shoulders. Loose strands floated into the warm afternoon light while the wolf remained perfectly still, its steady breathing filling the quiet room. "If anyone ever saw this," Emily murmured with an amused smile, "they would probably think I had completely lost my mind." The wolf responded with a soft rumble that sounded remarkably close to quiet happiness. Across the castle, however, another routine had begun to change as well. Every royal council meeting now contained one small interruption. Somewhere in the middle of discussions about trade routes, harvest reports, or border agreements, Cale would notice the empty space beside his chair where the wolf normally rested. His advisors gradually stopped reacting. The captain of the royal guard simply crossed one item from his daily checklist with resigned acceptance before continuing the meeting. Even the elderly steward no longer bothered sending servants to search. Everyone already knew where the wolf had gone. Everyone except the one man who insisted the behavior meant nothing. Late one afternoon, Cale walked through the Western training grounds after finishing a long meeting with neighboring delegates. He expected to find the wolf waiting near the castle entrance. Instead, he discovered it lying peacefully beside Emily beneath the old oak tree overlooking the gardens. She sat on a wooden bench reading aloud from a weathered collection of American folk tales that had somehow found its way into the royal library generations earlier. Her voice remained soft and steady while the wolf rested with its head across its front paws, listening with complete attention. Cale stopped walking. The scene felt strangely peaceful, almost as though it belonged to another life entirely. Emily noticed him first and immediately closed the book. "Your Majesty," she said, rising respectfully. The wolf looked toward Cale, wagged its tail once, then settled comfortably without moving an inch away from Emily. Cale stared at his companion for several quiet seconds. "You seem comfortable," he observed. Emily smiled apologetically. "I hope I have not encouraged bad habits." Cale folded his arms. I have attempted to discourage them. Emily glanced at the wolf. It does not seem interested in listening. A faint expression, so brief it almost disappeared before it formed, crossed Cale's face. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest anyone nearby had ever seen. No, he admitted. Lately it has not. Before either of them could continue, the castle bell rang, signaling the arrival of distinguished visitors from a neighboring territory. Servants hurried across the courtyards arranging flowers, preparing banquet tables, and polishing the marble entrance hall until it reflected the evening light. Emily quietly excused herself and returned to the archives, believing the excitement belonged to nobles rather than librarians. She did not notice several elegantly dressed guests studying her as she passed through the corridor with another stack of restored journals. One visitor paused to ask a servant a simple question. Who is the young woman? The servant answered politely, but his reply was too quiet for Emily to hear. Whatever he said caused the visitor to glance toward the silver-gray wolf resting only a few feet away before lifting his eyebrows with unmistakable interest. From across the courtyard, Cale witnessed the exchange. His attention shifted from the visiting noble to Emily, then to the wolf, whose ears had already lifted toward the unfamiliar stranger. For the first time since this strange pattern had begun, the peaceful calm surrounding the wolf quietly disappeared, replaced by a watchful stillness that neither Emily nor the guests fully understood, while Cale realized with growing unease that something inside his loyal companion had begun to change. The arrival of the visiting delegation transformed Ashthorn Keep almost overnight. Colorful banners fluttered above the stone walls. Musicians filled the courtyards with lively melodies, and long banquet tables stretched beneath sparkling chandeliers as servants hurried from one hall to another carrying polished silver trays and fresh flowers gathered before sunrise. Emily tried to remain invisible among the excitement. She preferred the quiet comfort of the archives, where old books never asked questions and dusty shelves never watched her with curious eyes. Unfortunately, remaining unnoticed became increasingly difficult. Everywhere she walked, she sensed respectful glances following her. Some were friendly, others carried quiet curiosity. None of them made sense to her. The silver-gray wolf accompanied her as naturally as ever, padding through the corridors with calm confidence before settling beside her while she organized centuries-old records. Even the newest servants accepted the unusual sight without surprise, as though someone had already explained the strange arrangement to every corner of the castle except the one person living inside it. That afternoon, Emily carried several restored journals toward the Grand Gallery, where rare manuscripts had been requested for the visiting scholars traveling with the delegation. As she carefully arranged the books across a carved walnut table, a warm voice interrupted her concentration. Those bindings are remarkable. Emily looked up to find a young alpha noble standing a respectful distance away. He appeared close to Cale's age, dressed in a navy blue formal coat embroidered with silver thread, his easy smile making him seem approachable rather than intimidating. I am Nathaniel Brooks, he said with a polite bow. I have always admired historical restoration, although I admit I have never possessed the patience for it. Emily smiled politely. Emily Carter. It is nice to meet you. Nathaniel glanced across the carefully repaired journals with genuine admiration. You restored these yourself? Emily nodded modestly. Most of them simply needed careful attention. That sounds like a rare talent, Nathaniel replied. Many people overlook old things because they only notice what appears new. You seem to notice what is worth saving. The unexpected compliment caught Emily by surprise. Before she could answer, familiar footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. The silver-gray wolf entered the gallery, immediately locating Emily among the towering shelves. Its ears lifted happily as it approached. Nathaniel watched with open fascination. So the stories are true, he said quietly. Emily blinked. Stories. Nathaniel smiled. Apparently the most loyal creature in the kingdom has decided you are its favorite person. Emily looked down, clearly embarrassed. I still do not understand why. The wolf calmly positioned itself beside her, gently brushing its shoulder against her arm before sitting with quiet confidence. Nathaniel laughed softly. Whatever the reason, I cannot say I blame it. You seem remarkably easy to trust. At almost the exact same moment, Kale stepped into the gallery from the opposite entrance after concluding a meeting with the delegation's senior officials. His silver eyes immediately found the wolf. Then they shifted toward Emily and Nathaniel standing together beside the display table. The conversation appeared harmless. Nathaniel maintained perfect courtesy. Emily looked relaxed for perhaps the first time since arriving at the castle. Yet something changed the instant the wolf noticed Nathaniel standing close beside her. Its posture straightened. The cheerful expression disappeared from its intelligent amber eyes. It quietly stepped forward until it stood between Emily and the visiting alpha. There was no growl, no threatening movement. Only a calm but unmistakable determination that gently increased the distance separating them. Nathaniel blinked with amused surprise before taking one respectful step backward. "I believe your guardian has reached a conclusion." Emily looked horrified. "I am so sorry. He has never behaved like this before." The wolf remained perfectly still, watching Nathaniel with complete attention. Kale observed the entire exchange from across the room. His expression remained composed, but something deep inside him tightened with uncomfortable familiarity. He had witnessed his wolf protect allies countless times over the years. This felt different. It was not defending against danger. It was quietly claiming space beside someone it refused to leave. Nathaniel, to his credit, handled the awkward moment with remarkable grace. He offered Emily another friendly smile. "Please do not worry. I suspect I have simply interrupted an established routine." Emily laughed nervously. "It certainly seems to believe so." After exchanging a few more polite words, Nathaniel excused himself to join the other guests. The wolf did not follow him with hostility. Instead, it immediately relaxed, returning to Emily's side as though satisfied everything had returned to its proper place. Kale slowly approached after the visiting noble disappeared into the next corridor. Emily looked toward him apologetically. "Your Majesty, I truly do not understand why it acted that way." Kale studied the wolf for a long, silent moment. Normally, he would have answered with the familiar explanation that had become almost automatic. "Instincts." The word rose to his lips, but refused to leave them. Instead, he watched as the wolf calmly leaned against Emily once more, completely content simply standing beside her. For the first time since this impossible pattern had begun, Kale found himself unable to offer even that simple excuse, because somewhere beneath his calm expression, he realized his wolf had not been following impulse at all. It had been making deliberate choices from the very beginning, and he could no longer pretend he had not noticed. Kale slept very little that night. Long after the castle had fallen silent and the final lanterns dimmed across the outer walls, he remained alone inside the royal study with reports spread across his desk. His eyes moved over trade agreements and harvest forecasts, but not a single sentence settled in his thoughts. Every time he closed one document, another memory returned instead. The wolf placing itself between Nathaniel Brooks and Emily without hesitation. The quiet confidence in its posture. The deliberate choice. It had not reacted to danger. It had reacted to possibility. That difference refused to leave his mind. Shortly before sunrise, Kale finally rose from his chair and crossed the empty hallway toward the oldest wing of Ashthorn Keep, where only a handful of people still visited regularly. Hidden behind a weathered stone arch stood a circular chamber lined with carved cedar shelves holding records far older than the kingdom itself. Waiting beside a small fireplace sat Elder Rowan, the castle historian and spiritual advisor, a man whose calm gray eyes had watched generations of alpha rulers grow from restless boys into patient kings. Without looking up from the ancient manuscript resting in his lap, Rowan quietly said, "You have come because your wolf has stopped obeying your explanations." Kale remained standing. "It still obeys my commands." Rowan smiled gently. "That is not what troubles you." Silence settled between them before Kale finally spoke. "It continues seeking the same Omega." Rowan closed the manuscript with deliberate care. "I have noticed." Kale folded his arms. "It follows her through the castle. It waits outside her room. It leaves every council meeting. Yesterday it refused to let another alpha stand beside her." Rowan nodded as though hearing confirmation of something he had expected for quite some time. "And what explanation have you been offering yourself?" Kale answered automatically. "Instincts." The old advisor chuckled so softly that the sound barely rose above the crackling fire. "You have repeated that word often enough that even the servants have begun borrowing it." Kale frowned slightly. Because it is the simplest answer. Simple answers are comforting, Rowan replied. They are not always true. The room became quiet once again. Outside, the first morning birds greeted the sunrise beyond the stained glass windows. Rowan slowly stood and walked toward an enormous mural carved into the circular wall. It depicted wolves standing beside kings, queens, and ordinary villagers alike beneath the same moonlit sky. Time had softened the colors, yet one inscription remained perfectly clear. Rowan rested his hand beneath the ancient carving. Our ancestors believe that a wolf carries the part of the heart that refuses to pretend. Cale looked toward the mural without speaking. Rowan continued in the same steady voice. A ruler can ignore loneliness. A ruler can bury affection beneath responsibility. A ruler can convince himself that duty matters more than desire. But the wolf does not understand such performances. Cale's expression remained composed, although his attention never left the inscription. Rowan turned to face him fully. When the wolf chooses someone again and again without command, it is not searching for comfort. It is revealing a truth the human heart has not yet accepted. Cale answered almost immediately. That is an old legend. Many legends survive because people continue proving them correct. Before Cale could respond, a gentle knock sounded outside the chamber. A young attendant bowed respectfully. Your Majesty, Miss Carter has begun restoring the royal family journals in the Western Archive. She requested permission to examine the oldest collection. Rowan smiled knowingly before the messenger departed. She treats forgotten things with extraordinary kindness. Cale quietly nodded. She does. The admission escaped so naturally that he barely noticed speaking it aloud. Rowan noticed. Tell me honestly, Majesty, when your wolf sits beside her, how does she respond? Cale considered the question. She never tries to command it. Does she fear it? At first. And now. Cale remembered Emily brushing silver fur beside the fireplace, reading stories beneath the oak tree, speaking gently as though the enormous creature were simply another lonely soul deserving patience. No, he answered quietly. Rowan's smile deepened. The wolf has recognized what you have only begun to see. Cale lowered his eyes briefly before looking toward the brightening window. Somewhere beyond the castle walls the morning bells welcomed another ordinary day, yet nothing about the last several weeks had felt ordinary. As he left the chamber and crossed the eastern courtyard, he spotted Emily through the open archive window, arranging fragile journals across a long wooden table while the silver-gray wolf rested peacefully at her feet, watching her turn each delicate page with careful hands. She looked completely unaware that she had become the center of questions even the oldest advisor in the kingdom could not dismiss. The wolf lifted its head the instant Cale entered the courtyard, but instead of running to him as it always had throughout the years, it glanced toward Emily first, as though silently asking permission before deciding where it belonged. And in that quiet hesitation Cale felt the certainty he had resisted for weeks begin to crack beneath the weight of a truth he was no longer certain he could deny. The annual moonlight gathering began beneath a sky so clear that every star seemed close enough to touch. Lanterns lined the castle gardens, their warm glow reflecting across marble pathways and quiet fountains while musicians filled the evening air with gentle melodies. Nobles from neighboring territories mingled beneath flowering trees, discussing alliances, harvests, and family traditions. Emily had been invited only because the royal archives displayed several restored historical manuscripts during the celebration, and she intended to spend most of the evening arranging the exhibit before quietly returning to her room. She never imagined anyone would notice her among so many distinguished guests. Yet before the evening was an hour old, Nathaniel Brooks approached her with the same easy kindness he had shown in the gallery. "Miss Carter," he said warmly, "I hoped I might thank you properly for explaining the history behind those journals yesterday. You made centuries of history feel alive." Emily smiled with genuine appreciation. "That is very kind of you to say." Nathaniel glanced toward the beautifully restored collection displayed beneath glass cases. "Would you allow me to walk with you through the exhibit? I suspect I would learn far more from the person who restored the pages than from the small description cards." Emily hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I would be happy to." They began strolling slowly through the garden pavilion, pausing beside ancient maps and handwritten chronicles, while Emily explained the stories hidden inside fading ink and weathered parchment. Nathaniel listened with sincere interest rather than polite obligation, asking thoughtful questions that gradually eased Emily's nervousness. For the first time since arriving at Ashthorne Keep, she found herself speaking freely about the work she loved. Several guests noticed the conversation and quietly smiled. It seemed perfectly ordinary. Across the courtyard, however, Cale stood speaking with foreign ambassadors while his attention drifted away from every diplomatic discussion. Without realizing it, his eyes repeatedly searched the gathering until they found Emily. She was laughing softly at something Nathaniel had said, her expression brighter than he had ever seen inside the archives. Cale should have been pleased that one of his guests treated her with such courtesy. Instead, an unfamiliar restlessness settled quietly beneath his calm exterior. Before he could identify the feeling, movement near the edge of the garden caught his attention. The silver-gray wolf had appeared from the shadows. It paused only briefly before walking directly toward Emily and Nathaniel. The surrounding conversations gradually softened as guests noticed the magnificent creature crossing the courtyard with calm determination. Emily looked down and smiled the instant she saw it. "There you are," she said gently. The wolf brushed against her side before positioning itself between her and Nathaniel once again. This time, however, it did something entirely unexpected. Instead of merely standing there, it sat beside Emily and rested its head lightly against her arm, never taking its amber eyes off the visiting alpha. Nathaniel blinked before letting out a quiet laugh. "I believe I have officially lost the competition for your attention." Emily looked embarrassed. "I truly do not know why this keeps happening." "Neither do I," Nathaniel admitted with good humor. "Although I cannot remember ever meeting anyone so thoroughly approved by the king's companion." Guests nearby exchanged amused glances. A few older nobles hid knowing smiles behind crystal glasses. Others discreetly looked toward Cale, curious whether the Alpha King would finally acknowledge what everyone else had begun to suspect. Cale slowly crossed the courtyard until he stood only a few feet away. The wolf glanced toward him but made no effort to move. Emily immediately stepped back respectfully. "Your Majesty." Cale nodded politely before looking at Nathaniel. "Lord Brooks, I trust you are enjoying your visit." "Very much," Nathaniel answered sincerely. "Your archives are extraordinary, and Miss Carter has been an exceptional guide." Cale's gaze shifted toward Emily for a brief moment. "She is dedicated to her work." Emily lowered her eyes, slightly embarrassed by the unexpected compliment. An awkward silence followed until Nathaniel smiled politely. "If you will excuse me, I promised to meet the Western delegation before the evening concert." He bowed respectfully and departed without the slightest hint of offense. The wolf watched him leave until he disappeared among the lanterns, then immediately relaxed and settled comfortably beside Emily once again. Cale remained standing there, studying his companion with growing disbelief. "You embarrassed our guest," he said quietly. The wolf answered by calmly wagging its tail once before looking back toward Emily, as though completely satisfied with the evening's outcome. Emily bit her lip, trying not to smile. "I do not think it meant any harm." Cale looked from the wolf to Emily, and then toward the distant crowd where Nathaniel had disappeared. Every logical explanation he had relied upon over the past weeks now sounded increasingly hollow inside his own mind. Elder Rowan's words returned with unmistakable clarity. "The wolf carries the part of the heart that refuses to pretend." Before Cale could answer, the castle choir began the opening song of the celebration. As voices rose beneath the moonlit sky, the wolf quietly moved closer to Emily once more, and without realizing it, Cale took the same single step forward, stopping beside her instead of returning to the waiting nobles. While more than one guest quietly noticed that for the first time all evening, the Alpha King no longer seemed to be following royal protocol. He seemed to be following his wolf. The celebration continued long after the music softened into quiet conversations beneath the stars. Yet for Cale the evening had already changed in ways no royal ceremony ever had. Every duty that normally demanded his attention seemed strangely distant. Advisors approached with questions about tomorrow's schedule, ambassadors waited for brief conversations, and honored guests raised glasses in his direction, but his thoughts repeatedly returned to one simple image. Emily laughing without hesitation. It was the first time he had seen her look completely at ease, and somehow that small moment lingered in his mind far longer than any political discussion. When the final performance ended and the guests slowly drifted back toward the castle, Emily quietly gathered the historical journals displayed during the celebration. She believed everyone else had forgotten about the exhibit. Before she could lift the last wooden case, another pair of hands reached for the opposite side. She looked up in surprise. "Your Majesty." Cale gave a small nod. "It appears these are heavier than they look." Emily smiled politely. "I can manage." "I know." He lifted the case anyway. Together, they walked through the quiet corridor leading toward the archives while the silver-gray wolf padded comfortably beside them. The castle seemed unusually peaceful after the lively celebration, with only the distant sound of crickets drifting through open windows. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It simply felt unfamiliar. At last, Emily gathered enough courage to ask the question that had quietly followed her for weeks. "May I ask you something?" Cale looked toward her. "Of course." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Does your wolf always trust people this easily?" Cale answered without looking away from the hallway ahead. "No." Emily frowned thoughtfully. "Then why me?" The question lingered between them. Cale had prepared countless diplomatic speeches during his years as king, yet he found himself with no convincing answer. Every explanation he had relied upon before now sounded incomplete. He finally replied with complete honesty. "I do not know." Emily accepted the answer with surprising calm. "Thank you for not pretending." Those simple words settled heavily in Cale's thoughts. "Not pretending." Elder Rowan's voice returned once more. "The wolf carries the part of the heart that refuses to pretend." They reached the archive entrance where Emily carefully unlocked the heavy wooden door. Moonlight poured through the tall windows, bathing rows of ancient books in soft silver light. The wolf entered first, immediately walking toward its familiar place beside the reading chair. Emily laughed quietly. "I suppose it believes this room belongs to both of us now." Cale watched the wolf settle down with complete contentment. "It certainly behaves as though it has made that decision." Emily arranged the journals across the table before noticing one fragile volume resting apart from the others. Its leather cover carried the royal crest, faded by centuries of careful use. Curious, she gently opened the first page. Inside, elegant handwriting recorded the history of earlier Alpha rulers and the companions who had stood beside them. Cale stepped closer as she carefully turned another page. One passage caught both of their attention. Emily read it aloud, almost in a whisper. "The wolf always recognized home before the king understood where it was." She stopped reading. The room fell completely silent. Neither of them spoke for several long moments. Finally, Emily closed the journal with careful hands. "That sounds beautiful," she said softly. "It does," Cale answered, although his voice carried a quiet weight she had never heard before. Emily looked toward the wolf sleeping peacefully beside the chair. "Perhaps that is why everyone keeps smiling whenever they see us together." Cale almost smiled himself. "Perhaps." She tilted her head curiously. "They know something that I do not they?" Cale let out a slow breath. For weeks, he had hidden behind a single convenient explanation. Every unusual moment, every impossible coincidence, every late-night disappearance, every quiet choice made by the wolf. He had dismissed them all with one familiar word because it demanded nothing from him in return. Standing inside the silent archive surrounded by the voices of generations preserved in ink, he realized he could no longer hide behind it. "Emily," he said quietly. She looked up. "There is something I owe you." Her expression grew uncertain, but never fearful. Cale glanced toward the sleeping wolf before meeting her eyes once more. "Every time you asked why my wolf kept finding you, I gave you the same answer." Emily nodded gently. "You said it was instincts." He lowered his gaze for the briefest moment before speaking with complete honesty. "I was wrong." Emily remained perfectly still. Cale's voice softened. "Or perhaps I was trying very hard to believe I was right." Outside, a cool breeze stirred the branches beyond the tall windows while moonlight shimmered across the polished wooden floor. The wolf slowly opened its amber eyes, looked first at Emily, then at Cale, and quietly rested its head back upon its paws, as though it had been patiently waiting for this single conversation from the very beginning. Emily searched Cale's face for several long moments, trying to understand the quiet honesty behind his words. She had expected another calm explanation, another carefully measured answer that would preserve the comfortable distance between a king and an ordinary omega. Instead, she found something entirely different. For the first time since arriving at Ashthorn Keep, the Alpha King looked less like a ruler carrying the weight of an entire kingdom and more like a man finally setting down a burden he had carried alone for far too long. The silence between them felt gentle rather than uncertain. It was Emily who finally spoke. "Then why did you keep saying it?" Cale looked toward the sleeping wolf before answering. "Because instincts are simple." His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable sincerity. "Duty is simple. Rules are simple. Feelings are not." Emily lowered her eyes thoughtfully. She understood those words better than he could possibly know. Since childhood, she had learned to make herself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook because expectations were simpler than hope. Hope had a way of asking difficult questions. She looked back at him with a small smile. "You believe the easier answer." Cale nodded once. "I did." Another quiet moment passed before Emily glanced toward the wolf resting peacefully beside the reading chair. "I think it stopped believing that answer long before either of us did." A faint smile finally reached Cale's eyes, soft enough that most people would never have noticed it. "I believe you are right." They left the archive together, walking through the peaceful hallways where moonlight stretched across polished stone floors. The castle had grown completely still. Servants had retired for the night. Musicians had packed away their instruments, and even the gardens seemed to rest beneath the quiet glow of the stars. When they reached the staircase leading toward the guest rooms, Cale stopped. "Emily." She turned. "Thank you." She looked surprised. "For what?" "For treating my wolf like it was more than a legend." Emily smiled warmly. "I never thought it wanted to be treated like a legend. It always seemed happier being treated like a friend." Cale watched the wolf, which calmly wagged its tail without lifting its head from the floor. "That sounds exactly like something it would choose." Emily laughed softly before wishing him good night and climbing the staircase toward her room. Cale remained where he stood until she disappeared around the corner. Only then did he continue toward his own chambers. For the first night in weeks, he did not call for the wolf to follow him. He simply opened his bedroom door and quietly waited. The wolf looked up at him. Then it glanced toward the staircase where Emily had vanished. Cale folded his arms with amused resignation. "Go ahead," he said gently. "I know you are already thinking about it." The wolf stood, gave him one grateful look, and trotted away through the silent corridor. Cale laughed under his breath, a sound so rare that even he hardly recognized it. A few moments later, Emily had just finished placing another log into the fireplace when she heard a familiar soft scratch outside her door. She smiled before opening it. The silver-gray wolf sat patiently in the hallway exactly as it had so many nights before, its amber eyes filled with quiet expectation. Emily shook her head with affectionate disbelief. "You really never give up, do you?" The wolf answered by wagging its tail. She stepped aside and left the door open. "You do not have to sneak in anymore," she whispered. "You are always welcome." The wolf entered with calm dignity, circled once beside the fireplace, and settled onto the familiar rug with a long, contented sigh. There were no secret midnight adventures this time. No mysterious entrance through impossible doors. No puzzled apologies waiting for sunrise. There was only peace. Outside, Cale stood beside his bedroom window overlooking the moonlit gardens. From across the courtyard, he noticed the warm light still glowing softly inside Emily's room. A moment later, he smiled to himself as he imagined exactly where his impossible companion had chosen to sleep. Elder Rowan's ancient words echoed one final time inside his thoughts. The wolf always recognized home before the king understood where it was. Cale no longer argued with the truth. Some answers could not be found in royal law, ancient traditions, or carefully planned decisions. Sometimes they arrived quietly, one ordinary night at a time, carried by loyal footsteps and an honest heart that refused to pretend. As dawn prepared to greet a new day over Ashthorn Keep, the castle awakened to a simple change that everyone except the two people at the center of it had already noticed. The wolf no longer wandered the halls searching for where it belonged. It had already found home, and at last, so had the heart of the Alpha King.